Section 22 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Cullen. Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. Section 22. Madame Crowl's Ghost, Part 1. 20 years have passed since you last saw Mrs. Jolliffe's tall, slim figure. She is now past 70, and can't have many milestones more to count on the journey that will bring her to her long home. The hair has grown white as snow, that is parted under her cap over her shrewd but kindly face. But her figure is still straight, and her step light and active. She has taken of late years to the care of adult invalids, having surrendered to younger hands the little people who inhabit cradles and crawl on all fours, those who remember that good-natured face among the earliest that emerge from the darkness of nonentity, and who owe to their first lessons in the accomplishment of walking and a delighted appreciation of their first babblings and earliest teeth, have spired up into tall lads and lasses now. Some of them shew streaks of white by this time in brown locks, the bonny gooden hair that she was so proud to brush and shew to admiring mothers, who are seen no more on the green of Golden Friars, and whose names are traced now on the flat grey stones in the churchyard. So the time is ripening some and searing others, and the saddening and tender sunset hour has come, and it is evening with the kind old North Country dame who nursed pretty Laura Mildmay, who now, stepping into the room, smiles so gladly and throws her arms round the old woman's neck and kisses her twice. "Now this is so lucky," said Mrs. Jenner. "You have just come in time to hear a story." "Really? That's delightful." Na, odd wit, no story or true for that. I said it with my ain iron. Ghosts, the very thing of all others I should most likely to hear of." "Well, dear," said Mrs. Jenner, "if you are not afraid, sit you down here with us." "She was just going to tell me all about her first engagement to attend a dying old woman," says Mrs. Jenner, "and of the ghost she saw there. Now, Mrs. Jolliffe, make your tea first, and then begin." The good woman obeyed, and having prepared a cup of that companionable nectar, she sipped a little, drew her brows slightly together to collect her thoughts, and then looked up with a wondrous solemn face to begin. Good Mrs. Jenner and the pretty girl each gazed with eyes of solemn expectation in the face of the old woman, who seemed to gather awe from the recollections she was summoning. The old room was a good scene for such a narrative, with the oak wainscoting, quaint and clumsy furniture, the heavy beams that crossed its ceiling, and the tall four-post bed with dark curtains, within which you might imagine what shadows you please. Mrs. Jolliffe cleared her voice, rolled her eyes slowly round, and began her tale in these words: Madame Crowl's Ghost. I'm an old woman now, and I was but 13 my last birthday, the night I came to Applewale House. My aunt was the housekeeper there, and a sort of one-horse carriage was down at Lexow, waiting to take me and my box up to Applewale. I was a bit frightened by the time I got to Lexow, and when I saw the carriage and horse, I wished myself back again with my mother at Hazelden. I was crying when I got into the shay, that's what we used to call it, and old John Mulberry that drove it, and was a good-natured fellow, bought me a handful of apples at the Golden Lion to cheer me up a bit, and he told me that there was a currant cake and tea and pork chops waiting for me, all hot, in my aunt's room at the great house. It was a fine moonlight night, and I eat the apples looking out of the shay window. It's a shame for gentlemen to frighten a poor foolish child like I was. I sometimes think it might be tricks. There was 2 on 'em on the tap of the coach beside me, and they began to question me after nightfall, when the moon rose, where I was going to. Well, I told them it was to wait on Dame Arabella Crowl of Applewale House, near by Lexow. "Ho then," says one of them, "you'll not be long there." And I looked at him as much as to say, why not? For I had spoken out when I told them where I was going, as if 'twas something clever I had to say. "Because," says he, "and don't you for your life tell no one, only watch her and see, she's possessed by the devil, and more'n half a ghost. Have you got a Bible?" "Yes, sir," says I, for my mother put my little Bible in my box, and I knew it was there, and by the same token, though the print's too small for my old eyes, I have it in my press to this hour. As I looked up at him saying, "Yes, sir," I thought I saw him winking at his friend, but I could not be sure. "Well," says he, "be sure you put it under your bolster every night. It will keep the old girl's claws off you." And I got such a fright when he said that you wouldn't fancy, and I'd a liked to ask him a lot about the old lady, but I was too shy, and he and his friend began talking together about their own concerns, and dowly enough I got down, as I told you, at Lexho. My heart sank as I drove into the dark avenue. The trees stand very thick and big, as old as the old house almost, and 4 people with their arms out and fingertips touching barely girds round some of them. Well, my neck was stretched out of the window, looking for the first view of the great house, and all at once we pulled up in front of it. A great white and black house it is, with great black beams across and right up it, and gables looking out as white as a sheet to the moon, and the shadows of the trees, 2 or 3 up and down in front. You could count the leaves on 'em, and all the little diamond-shaped window panes glimmering on the great hall window, and great shutters in the old fashion, hinged on the wall outside, bolted across all the rest of the windows in front, for there was but 3 or 4 servants, and the old lady in the house, and most of rooms was locked up. My heart was in my mouth when I said the journey was over, and this the great house afore me, and I sat near my aunt, and I never said till noo, and Dame Crowl that I was to come and wait upon, and was afeared on already. My aunt kissed me in the hall, and brought me to her room. She was tall and thin, with a pale face and black eyes, and long thin hands with black mittens on. She was past 50, and her word was short, but her word was law. I have no complaints to make of her, but she was a hard woman, and I think she would have been kinder to me if I had been her sister's child in place of her brother's, but all that's of no consequence noo. The squire, his name was Mr. Ch9 Crowls, he was Dame Crowl's grandson, came down there by way of seeing that the old lady was well treated, about 2 or 3 in the year. I see him but 2 all the time I was at Applewell House. I can't say but she was well taken care of, notwithstanding, but that was because my aunt and Meg Wyvern, that was her maid, had a conscience, and did their duty by her. Mrs. Wyvern, Meg Wyvern my aunt called her to herself, and Mrs. Wyvern to me, was a fat jolly lass of 50, a good height and a good breadth, always good-humoured and walked slow. She had fine wages, but she was a bit stingy, and kept all her fine clothes under lock and key, and wore mostly a twilled chocolate cotton with red and yellow, and green sprigs and balls on it, and it lasted wonderful. She never gave me nowt, not the valley or a brass thimble, all the time I was there, but she was good-humoured and always laughing, and she talked no end of proas over her tea. And seeing me so sackless and dowly, she roused me up with her laughing and stories, and I think I liked her better than my aunt. Children is so taken with a bit of fun or a story, though my aunt was very good to me, but a hard woman about some things, and silent always. My aunt took me into her bedchamber that I might rest myself a bit while she was setting the tea in her room, but first she patted me on the shoulder, and said I was a tall lass of my years, and had spired up well, and asked me if I could do plain work and stitching, and she looked in my face and said I was like my father, her brother that was dead and gone, and she hoped I was a better Christian, I wouldna do her their lids, would not do anything of that sort. It was a hard saying the first time I set foot in her room, I thought. When I went into the next room, the housekeeper's room, very comfortable, yak, oak all round, There was a fine fire blazing away with coal and peat and wood all in a low together, and tea on the table, and hot cake, and smoking meat. And there was Mrs. Wyvern, fat, jolly, and talking away, more in an hour than my aunt would in a year. While I was still at my tea, my aunt went upstairs to see Madam Crowl. "She's a gone up to see that old Judith Squales is awake," says Mrs. Wyvern. "Judith sits with Madam Crowl when me and Mrs. Shutters, that was my aunt's name, is away. She's a troublesome old lady. You'll have to be sharp wi' her, or she'll be into the fire and out at winder. She goes on wires, she does, old though she be." "How old, ma'am?" says I. 93 her last birthday, and that's 8 months gone," says she, and she laughed. "And don't be asking questions about her before your aunt, mind. I tell ye, just take her as you find her, and that's all." "And what's to be my business about her, please, ma'am?" says I. "About the old lady? Well," says she, "your aunt, Mrs. Shutters, will tell you that. But I suppose you'll have to sit in the room with your work, and see she's at no mischief, and let her amuse herself with her things on the table, and get her food or drink as she calls for it, and keep her out of mischief, and ring the bell hard if she's troublesome." "Is she deaf, ma'am?" "No, nor blind," says she, as sharp as a needle, "but she's gone quite awpy, and can't remember nowt rightly, and Jack the Giant Killer or Goody Two Shoes will please her as well as the King's Court, or the affairs of the nation." "And what did the little girl go away for, ma'am, that went on Friday last?" "My aunt wrote to my mother she was to go." "Yes, she's gone." "What for?" says I again. "She didn't answer Mrs. Shutters, I do suppose," says she. "I don't know. Don't be talking. Your aunt can't abide a talking child." "And please, ma'am, is the old lady well in health?" says I. "It ain't no harm to ask that," says she. "She's torflin' a bit lately, but better this week past, and I dare say she'll last out 100 years yet. Hish! Here's your aunt coming down the passage." In comes my aunt and begins talking to Mrs. Wyvern, and I, beginning to feel more comfortable and at home like, was walking about the room looking at this thing and at that. There was pretty old china things on the cupboard, and pictures again the wall, and there was a door open in the wainscot, and I seen a queer old leathern jacket with straps and buckles to it, and sleeves as long as the bedpost hanging up inside. End of section 22. Section 23 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Madam Crowl's Ghost, Part 2. "What's that you're at, child?" says my aunt sharp enough, turning about when I thought she least minded. "What's that in your hand?" "This, ma'am?" says I, turning about with the leathern jacket. "I don't know what it is, ma'am." Pale as she was, the red came up in her cheeks, and her eyes flashed with anger, and I think only she had 6 steps to take between her and me, she'd have give me a sizzop. But she did give me a shake by the shouther, and she plucked the thing out of my hand, and says she, "While ever you stay here, don't ye meddle with nowt that don't belong to ye," and she hung it up on the pin that was there, and shut the door with a bang and locked it fast. Mrs. Wyvern was lifting up her hands and laughing all this time, quietly in her chair, rolling herself a bit in it as she used when she was kinking. The tears was in my eyes, and she winked at my aunt, and says she, drying her own eyes that were wet with the laughing, "Tut, the child meant no harm. Come here to me, child. It's only a pair of crutches for lame ducks, and ask us no questions, mind, and we'll tell you no lies. And come here and sit down and drink a mug of beer before you go to your bed." My room, mind ye, was upstairs next to the old lady's, and Mrs. Wyvern's bed was near hers in her room, and I was to be ready at call, if need should be. The old lady was in one of her tantrums that night and part of the day before. She used to take fits of the sulks. Sometimes she would not let them dress her, and at other times she would not let them take her clothes off. She was a great beauty, they said, in her day. There was no one about Applewell that remembered her in her prime. And she was dreadful fond o' dress, and had thick silks and stiff satins and velvets and laces and all sorts, enough to set up 7 shops at the least. All her dresses was old-fashioned and queer, but worth a fortune. Well, I went to my bed. I lay for a while awake, for things was new to me, and I think the tea was in my nerves too, for I wasn't used to it, except now and then on a holiday or the like. And I heard Mrs. Wyvern talking, and I listened with my hand to my ear, but I could not hear Mrs. Crowl, and I don't think she said a word. There was great care took of her. The people at Applewell knew that when she died they would every one get the sack, and their situations was well paid and easy. The doctor came twice a week to see the old lady, and you may be sure they all did as he bid them. One thing was the same every time. They were never to cross or frump her any way, but to humour and please her in everything. So she lay in her clothes all that night, and next day not a word she said, and I was at my needlework all that day in my own room, except when I went down to my dinner. I would have liked to see the old lady, and even to hear her speak, but she might as well have been in London at the time for me. When I had my dinner, my aunt sent me out for a walk for an hour. I was glad when I came back. The trees were so big and the place so dark and lonesome, and 'twas a cloudy day, and I cried a deal thinking of home while I was walking alone there. That evening, the candles being alight, I was sitting in my room, and the door was open into Madame Crowl's chamber, where my aunt was. It was then for the first time I heard what I supposed was the old lady talking. It was a queer noise like, I couldn't well say which, a bird or a beast, only it had a bleating sound in it, and was very small. I pricked my ears to hear all I could, but I could not make out one word she said, and my aunt answered, "The evil one can't hurt no one, ma'am, 'bout the Lord permits." Then the same queer voice from the bed says something more that I couldn't make head nor tail on. And my aunt made answer again, "Let them pull faces, ma'am, and say what they will. If the Lord be for us, who can be against us?" I kept listening with my ear turned to the door, holding my breath, but not another word or sound came in from the room. In about 20 minutes, as I was sitting by the table looking at the pictures in the old Aesop's fables, I was aware of something moving at the door, and looking up I see my aunt's face looking in at the door, and her hand raised. "Hish!" says she, very soft, and comes over to me on tiptoe, and she says in a whisper, "Thank God she's asleep at last, and don't you make no noise till I come back, for I'm going down to take my cup of tea, and I'll be back anew, me and Mrs. Wyvern, and she'll be sleeping in the room, and you can run down when we come up, and Judith will gie ye your supper in my room." And with that she goes. I kept looking at the picture book as before, listening every now and then, but there was no sound, not a breath that I could hear, and I began whispering to the pictures and talking to myself to keep my heart up, for I was growing feared in that big room. And at last I got up and began walking about the room, looking at this and peeping at that, to amuse my mind, you'll understand. And at last what should I do but peeps into Madame Crowl's bedchamber. A grand chamber it was, with a great 4-poster bed, with flowered silk curtains as tall as the ceiling, and folding down on the floor, and drawn close all round. There was a looking glass, the biggest I ever said before, and the room was a blaze of light. I counted 22 wax candles all alight. Such was her fancy, and no one dared say her nay. I listened at the door and gaped and wondered all round. When I heard there was not a breath, and did not see so much as a stir in the curtains, I took heart and walked into the room on tiptoe, and looked round again. Then I takes a keek at myself in the big glass, and at last it came in my head, why couldn't I had a keek at the old lady herself in the bed? You'd think me a fool if you knew half how I longed to see Dame Crowl, and I thought to myself if I didn't peep now, I might wait many a day before I got so good a chance again. Well, my dear, I came to the side of the bed, the curtains being close, and my heart almost failed me, but I took courage and I slips my fingers in between the thick curtains and then my hand. So I waits a bit, but all was still as death. So softly, softly I draws the curtain, and there, sure enough, I sid before me, stretched out like the painted lady on the tombstone in Lexow Church, the famous Dame Crowl of Applewale House. There she was, dressed out. You never seed the like in they days. Satin and silk and scarlet and green and gold and pint lace. By Jen, 'twas a sight. A big powdered wig half as high as herself was the top of her head, and wow, was ever such wrinkles, and her old baggy throat all powdered white, and her cheeks rouged, and mouse skin eyebrows that Mrs. Wyvern used to stick on, and there she lay, proud and stark, wi' a pair of clocked silk hose on, and heels to her shoon as tall as ninepins. Lawk, but her nose was crooked and thin, and half the whites of her eyes was open. She used to stand, dressed as she was, giggling and dribbling before the looking-glass, wi' a fan in her hand and a big nosegay in her bodice. Her wrinkled little hands were stretched down by her sides, and such long nails, all cut into points, I never sid in my days. Could it even have been a fashion for grit folk to wear their finger-nails so? Well, I think ye'd ha' been frightened yourself if you'd ha' seen such a sight. I couldn't let go the curtain, nor move an inch, nor take my eyes off her. My very heart stood still. And in an instant she opens her eyes, and up she sits, and spins herself round and down wi' a clack on her two tall heels on the floor, facing me, ogling in my face wi' her two great glassy eyes, and a wicked simper wi' her wrinkled lips and long fause teeth. Well, a corpse is a natural thing, but this was the dreadfullest sight I ever said. She had her fingers straight out pointing at me, and her back was crooked round again wi' age. Says she, "Ye little limb, what did ye say? I killed the boy. I'll tickle ye till you're stiff." If I'd a thought an instant, I'd a turned about and run, but I couldn't take my eyes off her, and I backed from her as soon as I could, and she came clattering after like a thing on wires, with her fingers pointing to my throat, and she making all the time a sound with her tongue like zzz, zzz, zzz. I kept backing and backing as quick as I could, and her fingers was only a few inches away from my throat, and I felt I'd lose my wits if she touched me. I went back this way right into the corner, and I gave a yellock. You'd think soul and body was parting, and that minute my aunt from the door calls out wi' a blare, and the old lady turns round on her, and I turns about and ran through my room and down the stairs as hard as my legs could carry me. I cried hearty, I can tell you, when I got down to the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Wyvern laughed a deal when I told her what happened, but she changed her key when she heard the old lady's words. "Say them again," says she. So I told her. "Ye little limb, what for did ye say I killed the boy? I'll tickle ye till you're stiff." "And did ye say she killed a boy?" says she. "Not I, ma'am," says I. Judith was always up with me after that. When the two elder women was away from her, I would have jumped out at window rather than stay alone in the same room with her. It was about a week after, as well as I can remember, Mrs. Wyvern one day when me and her was alone, told me a thing about Madame Crowl that I did not know before. She being young and a great beauty, full 70 year before, had married Squire Crowl of Applewale, but he was a widower and had a son about 9 years old. There never was tale or tidings of this boy after one morning. No one could say where he went to. He was allowed too much liberty, and used to be off in the morning one day to the keeper's cottage and breakfast wi' him, and away to the warren and not home, mayhap till evening, and another time down to the lake and bathe there and spend the day fishing there, or paddling about in the boat. Well, no one could say what was gone wi' him, only this. that his hat was found by the lake under a hawthorn that grows there to this day, and 'twas thought he was drowned bathing. And the squire's son by his second marriage with this Madam Crowl that lived so dreadful long came in for the estates. It was his son, the old lady's grandson, Squire Ch8 Mrs Crowls, that owned the estates at the time I came to Applewale. There was a deal of talk long before my aunt's time about it, and 'twas said the stepmother knew more than she was like to let out, and she managed her husband, the old squire, with her white heft and flatteries, and as the boy was never seen more, in course of time the thing died out of folks' minds. I'm going to tell you noo about what I said with my own eyen. End of section 23. Section 24, Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Madam Crowl's Ghost, Part 3. I was not there 6 months, and it was winter time when the old lady took her last sickness. The doctor was afeard she might have took a fit of madness, as she did 15 years before, and was buckled up many a time in a strait waistcoat, which was the very leathern jerkin I sid in the closet off my aunt's room. Well, she didn't. She pined and whindered, and went off torflin, quiet enough, till a day or two before her flitting, and then she took to rambling and sometimes skirling in the bed. You'd think a robber had a knife to her throat, and she used to work out of the bed, and not being strong enough then to walk or stand, she'd fall on the floor with her old wizened hand stretched before her face, and skirling still for mercy. Ye may guess I didn't go into the room, and I used to be shivering in my bed with fear at her skirling and scraffling on the floor, and blaring out words that'd make your skin turn blue. My aunt and Mrs. Wyvern and Judith Squales, and a woman from Lexo, was always about her. At last she took fits, and they wore her out. Sir was there and prayed for her, but she was past praying with. I suppose it was right, but none could think there was much good in it, and sat at long last she made her flitting and was over. And old Dame Crowl was shrouded and coffined, and Squire Chevenix was wrote for. But he was away in France, and the delay was so long that to Sir and Doctor both agreed it would not do to keep her longer out of her place, and no one cared but just them two, and my aunt and the rest of us from Applewale to go to the burying. So the old lady of Applewale was laid in the vault under Lexo Church, and we lived up at the great house till such time as the squire should come to tell his will about us, and pay off such as he chose to discharge. I was put into another room 2 doors away from what was Dame Crowl's chamber after her death, and this thing happened the night before Squire Chevenix came to Applewale. The room I was in now was a large square chamber covered with yak panels, but unfurnished except for my bed, which had no curtains to it, and a chair and a table or so that looked nothing at all in such a big room, and the big looking glass that the old lady used to keek into and admire herself from head to heel. Now that there was no mair of that work, was put out of the way and stood against the wall in my room, for there was shifting of many things in her chamber, you may suppose, when she came to be coffined. The news had come that day that the squire was to be down next morning at Applewale, and not sorry was I, for I thought I was sure to be sent home again to my mother. And right glad was I, and I was thinking of her at home, and my sister Janet, and the kitten and the pig Mag, and Trimmer the tyke, and all the rest. And I got so fidgety I couldn't sleep, and the clock struck 12 and me wide awake, and the room as dark as pick. My back was turned to the door and my eyes toward the wall opposite. Well, it couldna be a full 12:15 when I sees a lighting on the wall before me, as if something took fire behind, and the shadows of the bed and the chair and my gown that was hanging from the wall was dancing up and down on the ceiling beams and the yak panels, and I turns my head o'er my shoulder quick, thinking something must have gone afire. And what should I see, by Jen, but the likeness of the old beldame be dizened out in her satins and velvets on her dead body, simpering, wi' her eyes as wide as saucers and her face like the fiend himself. 'Twas a red light that rose about her in a fuffing low, as if her dress round her feet was blazing. She was driving on right for me, wi' her old shrivelled hands crooked as if she was going to claw me. I could not stir, but she passed me straight by, wi' a blast o' cold air, and I sid her at the wall in the alcove, as my aunt used to call it, which was a recess where the state bed used to stand in old times, wi' a door open wide, and her hands groping in at something was there. I never sid that door before. And she turned round to me like a thing on a pivot, flying, and all at once the room was dark, and I standing at the far side of the bed. I don't know how I got there, and I found my tongue at last, and if I didna blare a yellock, running down the gallery and almost pulled Mrs. Wyvern's door off t' hooks, and frighted her half out of wits. You may guess I didn't sleep that night, and with the first light down with me to my aunt as fast as my 2 legs could carry me. Well, my aunt didn't frump or flight me as I thought she would, but she held me by the hand and looked hard in my face all the time, and she telled me not to be feared, and says she, "Hed the appearance of key in its hand?" "Yes," says I, bringing it to mind, "a big key in a queer brass handle." "Stop a bit," says she, letting go my hand, and opening the cupboard door. "Was it like this?" says she, taking one out in her fingers, and showing it to me with a dark look in my face. "That was it," says I, quick enough. "Are you sure?" she says, turning it around. "Sot," says I, and I felt like I was going to faint when I said it. "Well, that will do, child," says she, softly thinking, and she locked it up again. "The squire himself will be here to-day before 12 o'clock, and you must tell him all about it," says she, thinking, and I suppose I'll be leaving soon. "And so the best thing for the present is that you should go home this afternoon, and I'll look out another place for you when I can." Fain was I, ye may guess, at that word. My aunt packed up my things for me and the £3 that was due to me to bring home, and Squire Crowl himself came down to Applewell that day, a handsome man about 30 years old. It was the second time I sid him, but this was the first time he spoke to me. My aunt talked with him in the housekeeper's room, and I don't know what they said. I was a bit feared on the squire, he being a great gentleman down in Lexo, and I daren't go near till I was called. And says he, smiling, "What's a this ye send, child? It mun be a dream, for you know there's na sic a thing as a beau or freet in all the world. But whatever it was, my little maid, sit ye down and tell all about it from first to last." Well, so soon as I made an end, he thought a bit, and says he to my aunt, "I mind the place well. In old Sir Oliver's time, Lame Wendell told me there was a door in that recess to the left, where the lassie dreamed she saw my grandmother open it. He was past 80 when he told me that, and I but a boy. The plate and jewels used to be kept there long ago, before the iron closet was made in the arras chamber, and he told me the key had a brass handle. And this, you say, was found in the bottom of the kist where she kept her old fans. Now, would not it be a queer thing if we found some spoons or diamonds forgot there? You mun come up wi' us, lassie, and point to the very spot." Loath was I, and my heart in my mouth, and fast I held my aunt's hand as I stepped into that awesome room, and showed them both how she came and passed me by, and the spot where she stood, and where the door seemed to open. There was an old empty press against the wall then, and shoving it aside, sure enough, there was the tracing of a door in the wainscot, and a keyhole stopped with wood, and planed across as smooth as the rest, and the joining of the door all stopped with putty the colour of yak. And, but for the hinges that showed a bit when the press was shoved aside, you would not consate there was a door there at all. "Ha!" says he, with a queer smile, "this looks like it." It took some minutes wi' a small chisel and hammer to pick the bit o' wood out of the keyhole. The key fitted sure enough, and wi' a strang twist and a long skreek the bolt went back and he pulled the door open. There was another door inside, stranger than the first, but the lacks was gone and it opened easy. Inside was a narrow floor and walls and vault o' brick. We could not see what was in it, for 'twas dark as pick. When my aunt had lighted the candle, the squire held it up and stepped in. My aunt stood on tiptoe trying to look over his shoulder, and I didna see nowt. "Ha, ha," says the squire, stepping backward. "What's that? Give me the poker quick," says he to my aunt. And as she went to the hearth I peeps beside his arm, and I said, squat down in the far corner, a monkey or a flayin' on the chest, or else the maist shrivelled up, wizened old wife that ever was seen on earth. "By Jen," says my aunt, as putting the poker in his hand. She keeked by his shouther and said the ill-favoured thing, "Ha' care, sir, what you're doing. Back wi' ye and shut to the door." But in place of that he steps in saftly with the poker pointed like a sword, and he gives it a poke, and down it all tumbles together, head and in a heap o' bairns and dust, little mair and a hatful. 'Twas the bairns o' a child. Aye, the rest went to dust at a touch. They said nowt for a while, but he turns round the skull as it lay on the floor. Young as I was, I consaited I knew well enough what they were thinking on. "A dead cat," says he, pushing back and blowing out the candle and shutting to the door. "We'll come back, you and me, Mrs. Shutters, and look on the shelves by and by. I've other matters first to speak to ye about. And this little girl's going home, you say? She has her wages, and I mun make her a present," says he, patting my shoulder with his hand. And he did give me a good £1, and I went off to Lexo about an hour after, and sae home by the stage coach. And fain was I to be at home again, and I never sid Dame Crowl or Applewale, God be thanked, either in appearance or in dream at efter. But when I was grown to be a woman, my aunt spent a day and night with me at Littleham, and she tell't me there was no doubt it was the poor little boy that was missing so lang syne, that was shut up to die there in the dark by that wicked beldame, where his skirls or his prayers or his thumping could na be heard, and his hat was left by the water's edge, whoever did it, to make belief he was drowned. The clothes at the first touch ran into a snuff o' dust in the cell where the bairns was found, but there was a handful o' jet buttons and a knife with a green heft, together wi' a couple of pennies the poor little fella had in his pocket, I suppose, when he was decoyed in there and sid his last o' the light. And there was among the squire's papers a copy of the notice that was printed after he was lost, when the old squire thought he might ha' run away or been took by gipsies. And it said he had a green hefted knife with him, and that his buttons were a cut jet. Sa that is, I have to say concerning old Dame Crowl o' Applewale House. End of section 24.